Hello and welcome to the Yes Effect, stories that transform lives, in the cycle that we're in with our programs. People who dared to heed a call, a vision, to produce transformation when faced with tragedy, faced with a society that many times is vulnerable, not only remain expectant in a passive way, but rather to do something to produce a transformation. Luis Bush, today we're going to talk about Ukraine and orphans, the story of Steve Weber, the protagonist and his team. How does that story begin? Because it starts with a married couple who suffers a tragedy in their personal lives, and they also see the tragedy around them of abandoned children, orphaned children. Steve Weber himself, he and his wife adopted, and then they received from the Lord a burden, a feeling of a call to establish that in Ukraine. And Ukraine was a country that for many years the orphans were very badly treated, as if they had defective genes. So they were treated very badly. Each one abandoned in these centers. Our daughter was in one of those places for 3 months, and no one picks them up, no one takes care of them. They were very abandoned. So the burden that Steve Weber had was to see how he could face and respond to the need of recognizing that orphans need our attention. Steve Weber's family adopts a boy in the year 1995, but really their work begins in 2008 with potency, with force. And there I'd like to link the story with another married couple. In fact, one of them is HIV positive. And this couple, who even have children, despite that situation, are very strong protagonists in rescuing orphans from the street and taking them to their homes. Talk to us a little about that couple. Yes, their names are Evgeny and Svetna. Svetna is the wife, and in those days, if a family wanted to adopt, the woman had to prepare her by putting a pillow under her shirt. So people would think something was happening, that she was going to have a child, but really she was going to adopt an orphan. So that was the experience, because adopting orphans was looked down upon in such a way. But in the case of this couple, they did something very special, in that despite having this virus, they say, we're going to adopt a child with the virus. And so they adopt into their family as a couple, and then they continue to adopt more and more. And the story is incredible, because there comes a moment of annual celebration in the country of Ukraine when they celebrate the person who's voted on by a chosen group, but they vote on people who have had the most impact on the country. So in 2012 is when they decide that this couple is going to be the couple that receives the prize. So there are people who are recognized as the most important from all kinds of influence in the country, and there appears this couple with a large family, and among them is a child, an orphan with HIV. The story is remarkable because someone who's living the disease and has a sensitivity to help sick people, such as an orphan, and take them into their home, because not only was it one child, it was a few, several. And it also speaks of the yes effect. In other words, someone who can also say, I, with these limitations, can't help anyone. I have to resolve my own problems, and they don't have the sensitivity to help others. However, they adopt and begin to create a revolution by rescuing orphaned children. Is that how it was? That's right, and it's a revolution because it changed the mentality of the whole population. Because the First Lady is now supporting this work. She called upon the president himself of that country. So they're supporting in different ways. And really it's been a revolution in the way of thinking about orphans for the whole nation. And many orphans that were on the street, around 30,000 of them when they started, were on the streets, mostly in the capital. I was with Ruslan Maliuta, who was the person who's carried out the majority of this work, and today there are 6,000 to 6,000. Not only families, but also 6,000 Christian churches have adopted. Each church, to be real, a serious church, they had to adopt their own orphan. A family in the church had to adopt an orphan. So the churches have adopted, the families have adopted, and there are many who are needing adoption comparatively. What I find amazing about this couple, going back to the topic of the couple, is that many times I'm in very favorable conditions to help people, and I don't. And they're in absolutely unfavorable conditions, even with a sickness that the world sees as a stigma, and they say, this illness doesn't limit the yes effect of what I think that God is calling me to do, to produce a transformation. On the contrary, when someone is in a situation like that, they're more sensitive to others with the same problem. So in this case, she responds by saying, where are others who have this condition? I know it's hard to live with this condition in my country. So she really has a strong motivation, even more, to find others like that. So there are two sides, not just one. We don't want to have people with these kinds of serious problems, but on the other side, there's, I understand your case, and I want to respond to that need directly. How does Steve Weber connect to all this project? Yes, Steve Weber is invited to go as the director of CBN in the country of Ukraine. And when he arrives there and finds the situation, he and his wife had adopted a boy, and they see the difficult, tremendous conditions that the adoption centers in the country have. So in his mind, in his heart, with his wife, they say, here we are with a mission related to radio and television, but we're going to respond feeling what we feel because we know the need that they have as orphans. So he calls his friends. It's the first step. He has some friends, and among them is Ruslan Maliuta, who becomes the global coordinator now of the movement. And the second is Nikolai Kuleba, who today is on the committee, part of the key group to the presidency of the country, as a voice for orphans. So Steve invited them to his house, and the first meeting is to share their heart and the burden that they have. The second is to seek God and ask, what are we going to do with this huge burden we have? We're going to seek God. And in that seeking of God was when Nikolai Kuleba, who we've met and spoken to and interviewed, a very dedicated man, he says when he was praying, Lord, give me a Ukraine without orphans. And that came to be the phrase that everyone remembered. Ukraine without orphans. The declaration was in a prayer. So instead of a huge campaign, they believe strongly in prayer. So they keep praying and seeking God, and God has done so much in that country, miraculously. You mentioned a very interesting aspect, that Steve Weber decides to form a network of friends, and he calls them, motivates them for a project that he couldn't do alone. And there we find a remarkable principle that has to do with teamwork. It has to do with injecting your burden into others as well. Surely there were people who knew and could be sensitive to this cause, and it's interesting. I'd like for you to develop that more, because there are many people who have that sensitivity. In every country there's a problem with abandoned children, vulnerability issues, and people become sensitive and want to be like a Don Quixote. In other words, I'm going to try to solve everything myself. Now they don't understand that maybe it would be better to convene with others. How does that work? I think that it's a fundamental step for the development of this vision that's been so impressive on a global scale. The thing is, we have friends and we share our concerns and our lives with them. So it's the first logical step, right? To share the burden that's on my heart with the heart of a friend that I have. So that's what he did, and we think about our friends and that they have their own concerns, but they can share a little of our burden too. The Bible says to share our burdens with each other in the family of God. So they're sharing their burdens. It was another step. First, convene with friends, share the burdens, and the others took those concerns in that moment, and then Nikolai Kuleba comes up with a mission with the words and the prayer. But yes, friendship is a fundamental step. Family is one step, right? With our family, but friends also is one. When there's a drama or tragedy that involved thousands, because there weren't hundreds, there were thousands of orphans, and we want a Ukraine without orphans. How hard is that goal? Because it's almost impossible without resources, without people. Where do I take the men? How did they do it? First, they did it in a church. So in that church where they were, some of them, they said, we're going to have this church adopt at least one orphan. So that church and other churches, and there are different types of churches, right? Catholics and others, but they all agreed with that vision. And little by little they started going in, not all at once. So in that country, all the churches of different kinds agreed, and they're trying to have the local church inside that group without orphans. So it's a process that's... I want to stop you there just a moment, because bringing churches together, not only Protestant churches, there were also Catholic churches, I imagine, and Orthodox churches. How do you unite these differences for a common purpose? How did they do it? Of course, they didn't do it intentionally, step by step. Others just simply listened. For example, the church that's more or less the state church there heard what was happening. So they said, we want to be part of it. They didn't go to their doors and say, come and help us, but rather they themselves. So in some cases it just happened by word of mouth, person to person, right, through friends. The other part is that also the government became interested in this case. The government that's had pressure as far as the orphans go. And they had them pinned as having these defective genes. And they saw in this new phase, not communist, that they had to have a new way of thinking. And instead of thinking about defective genes, they thought, we have to give them hope. So the president himself and his wife have activated and have called people of influence to deal with this. And you can see on the internet these open-air meetings there in Ukraine. So the governmental leadership is now participating also. And the radios are participating. Steve Weber with the radio, all the radios involved. So they've mobilized people from the church, the government, through the radio, and that's why they're having a very big impact. Now this is born through a social movement, a movement that's connected with the churches, and that vision is finally transformed into public policies so as not to have orphans in Ukraine. Yes, that's right, and it's also spiritual and church related. But yes, now it's also at the level of the government itself that's participating in this. So it's a thing that also other countries have wanted, but it hasn't quite been as immediately responsive. But this started in 2008, more or less, and now here we are in 2018, and here we see now in 40 countries around the world, Ruslan Maliuta has been sent, encouraged to travel, and we've had him in our home with his wife recently, and he's traveling all over the world and having global events. He's had some events, 2 or 3 events in these years globally. But through the nation in Latin America, that's responded the most is Paraguay. Paraguay with the church and with political figures. and businessmen have also become involved. So there's now a group that's in charge that represents the different entities, dimensions of influence in the country. And in Paraguay, the group is working pretty well, and there's a coordinator within the group. So they have certain procedures as far as strategies to establish the base and the national representatives. When you look at the records from 2008, when the movement started, there were 30,000 orphans in Ukraine, and today I think there are 6,000? 6,000 to 8,000. In other words, the result is overwhelming, successful. And what do you contribute that to? Because I understand that this comes through a married couple, but Steve Weber is also a person who connects with this couple, and they began a very challenging work. It's unlimited, and they have to bring together a network of churches from all over the country, churches obviously so that transformation is produced. So where do you see the virtues of these people for the married couple as well as Steve Weber? Well, I know Steve Weber, we know him well, a man of God. He's a man who's sensitive to national challenges. He was in the Eastern European world for many years, so God challenged him greatly in those places with his own experiences, with having an orphan in the home, with his house, with his wife. They experienced it personally. But his commitment to prayer is an important part. He intercedes, he recognizes the power of God, which has no limitations. So I think that he found a key to open a basket of blessings. And from there, he's also had friendships. He's a man who seeks genuine friendships, authentic friendships. And in that, he's crossed cultural barriers because he was an American arriving there, and there's emerged as a result someone like him, Nikolai Kuleba, who's a national. And he's taken on the responsibility of the nation. He spoke at that first meeting, and now he's invited by presidents to be part of their circle to confront all this at a national level. So there are these two people and their wives. I also want to touch on a point that has to do with how this moves to other nations. I understand that the model from Ukraine has also produced a large impact in Uganda. So taking it from Ukraine to see the same transformation in Uganda, talk to me a little about that case. Yes, with the same principles, examples, and motivation to Uganda and traveling to many places. In 40 countries now all over the world from that date, they have their program, their initiative, their group committed to see that country without orphans. So to think that that movement from then to now is almost miraculous. I can't help but ask you a question about this issue because you always think about the issue of resources. All of this has to require a lot of economic resources. So there are people who have dreams, who have visions, and they say, resources impede my yes effect. It almost becomes the no effect. I can't do it because I have too many limitations for so much social tragedy. Here there's an example in that they went by a way that said, well, God will be the fabricator of the resources, so I'm going to do it anyway. How do you break that? Well, I think you said it. God is the one who has the resources in his hands. So he knew how to open with the key of prayer. He opened the door of resources, and these resources came to touch the hearts of other people, like the president's wife, like these leaders who are normally in their groups, in their churches, but suddenly their minds open, and they accept that an idea can come from another group that isn't part of their group. And not only accept, but adapt and commit to the vision. So we see that it's a process. But the main resource that he knew, that Steve Weber understood, is that our main resource is to know how to touch the heart of the Lord, of God. In the Word of God, he's very clear about the needs of orphans. And so it's something that God responded. to that call. And it's not only the call of one person or two with his wife, but of a whole group. And when there are 2 or 3 in my presence, seeking my presence, says the Lord, I'll give it. So when the group grows and they agree about one thing that's in the heart of God, well, the resources started to flow in a much faster way. And then there are resources within these different groups also. For example, within the local church, there are many resources, right? There's potential for resources. So each church, one orphan. So this is already possibility because it's within the commitment and the possibility that can come from having a church. In this story that we're discussing in the Yes Effect, there are always issues from the personal life. Here there's a married couple that starts with this burden, including one of them with an illness, and they're able to have a child and they adopt. But through the years that pass, those children grew. So how do you bring about a story that can be the parents' story? And the child says, look, I'm willing to respect my parents in this decision, but my life as a child goes in a different direction. But this story is one of the whole family. They bring their whole family into this project. So talk to us a little about that also, because many people start with a vision, a burden, a calling, a yes effect, and we start out together as a married couple, but when it's time to call on the family, bring in the children and include them in the whole story, that also has a cost. It has a cost for the family because the emphasis can also draw resources of the commitment from the heart, from the attention. The attention of the mother, for example, she's going to be attending to the orphan that's in the family more than before. So there's really a limited resource, humanly speaking. But in the family that catches the vision, the children begin to participate in the vision as well. In other words, we have a large family. We have 20 grandchildren. So these 20 grandchildren, some are helping others in the family. In the biggest family, the older ones help with the younger ones with pleasure. It's a calling. It's wanting to do it. So it can be within families. And the family of God is another one in a nation. It's the president saying, we're going to see Ukraine without orphans. So those are the different areas. But for the family itself, yes, there's a cost. And in that family, there was a cost. But the big surprise is that they haven't just survived. They're coming together as a family, it seems. It's not that they don't have problems. They have serious problems. Have you met this family, the married couple? No, not directly. No, I haven't met them. I know Steve Weber very well and the Raslin Maluta family very well, as they've been in our home. So we know those who have been close, but this family, I don't think I've met them. Maybe they came to one of the events, but I didn't meet them. In the case of Steve Weber, when you talk about the hard things he's lived through in this process, what does he consider has been the hardest? For him, Steve Weber, to bring together a whole nation or a number of institutions. It was friends at first. I think one of the challenges within his mission, CBN, was that he was going out of the lines, out of the established format, right? So to emphasize that with so much time and resources of his own, his and his wife's attention to something that wasn't within the framework of CBN's vision. So it was something that could have happened with time. And sure, his experience has been so positive. He already had acceptance and recognition. So when he says, this is what's happening, immediately they say to him, no, that can't be done within our mission because we have a vision as CBN that doesn't include orphans or adopting orphans. So they had to, in a sense, change that because CBN's workload has grown, so it's probably part of their radio mission now. What I've noticed in his story is that he adopts a son in the year 1995. However, he's injected with this vision 13 years later. And there's something interesting here. The yes effect, there are different moments, different stages, different periods. All of this was a laboratory, a previous training for him. Or maybe it was a resistance for him. It could have been, I don't know. But it's interesting, and I'd like to know your vision in all these cases, because what God or what people feel as a call doesn't necessarily have to be now. That can happen even a decade before it materializes. And this case was like that. The yes effect is normally a series of yeses. So the first yes effect can be something small, and there's a relationship with the yes effect in the Bible, right? More than anything, the effect of a yes to God. In other words, we're responding to what's in the heart of God. So in this case, he said yes, and then came another challenge, another yes. So he begins with his own personal adoption with his wife. Then he comes after many years with that experience, as you mentioned, of success, of blessing, of help, and really being able to help the son at home. So the burden keeps growing. If I've experienced this, why can't others? Why can't another? Because I see the need in this country that's suffered so much, especially the orphanages and that environment, orphans that have been abandoned in those places. So seeing all this case, arriving to that country for the first time, comparing how the treatment of orphans in different countries that he's experienced or lived, so he comes to the conclusion, I have to do something. And his wife agrees with him. He brings together his friends and all are steps toward the yes, but many times it's a yes with the first thing, and that yes can take us to a second yes, a third yes, a fourth yes. And the most important yes in history is Jesus' yes when he says, not my will, Father, but yours be done. This is a remarkable case because of the following. Because there are countries, including where I'm from, Chile, that haven't been able to resolve the situation of abandoned children and issues of public policy, including carrying it into institutions that have been subsidized by the state, where children have been abused, they've been raped. There have been tremendous tragedies that have happened to them. But here there's a case that doesn't come from the public policies of a state, but rather it comes from simply a family that brings together a network of churches, no matter their denomination, and it transforms into successful policies of the state. So this case is successful, and how interesting this model is, because finally it doesn't come from the state, which you suppose has to resolve the orphan problem, but rather it comes from a social movement, to put it that way. What do you see there that was crucial for this to be a successful case? Why is it successful there? Well, I think that he has to be successful in his own personal experience. In other words, the experience with the orphan in the family. In the case of Steve Weber, and the couple too. That experience that they've had. Without living the experience personally, it's very difficult to be an advocate for such an experience in other entities at a national level. So that was the case. It's living and struggling and going through things, and you have your own children. There are enough struggles and problems when they're growing up, and in these environments where we live today, in the world of the internet, where children ages 4 to 14 spend 7 hours on average per day. And it's a very big challenge today, because they're receiving basically their education not only at school but outside of school, and from an acultural world. It has no culture in that sense, and they're receiving it from all sides. So it's very challenging, and it has to be a personal experience that someone has. Did you meet Steve Weber's wife? No, I know Steve, but no, maybe once, but I don't think so. Steve and I have known each other for several years, though. Seeing Steve Weber's work, evidently there are great women behind him, behind the person. The role of the woman, talk to us a little about that in this transformation. Well, think of your wife, Carolina, and how important she is to your life. And my wife, Doris, how they've accompanied us in our pilgrimage through life, through ministry, through family. And it starts right there with our wives, thanking God for them, for their support. And sometimes they go before us, don't they? With ideas. In Doris's case, she's gone before me several times in new mission initiatives that we've had. But I think that I forgot the question. The role of the woman in transformation projects, because generally the man appears visibly written down, the name there, Steve Weber, but I don't think that Steve Weber was able to do all of this if not for his companion. No, the role of the woman in this case was very difficult, but if she didn't want to, I don't know if I mentioned this yet, but when they didn't want to show that they had a child in the house that was an orphan, they could only have biological children, referring to before all this happened in 2008. So women literally had to go and find a pillow and place it under her shirt to pretend she was pregnant just before adopting a child, to hide the reality that they were about to take that step, because it was prohibited. Not prohibited, but rather socially sanctioned. Socially sanctioned. So the miracle was what changed all the idea in that country of Ukraine when it comes to orphans. Because in 2012, a few years after all this started, as we saw, they had the celebration of the most important people of the country. And it was this couple. The pride of the country. They awarded him. They won the award of the people with the most impact, the most influence that year in that country. And before they had thought nothing of orphans. They didn't want to even think about it. And now they're celebrating the couple that had adopted these orphans. Remarkable a story, the Yes Effect. Stories that transform lives.